Okay, and good afternoon again.
The third good afternoon will be nighttime.
Third, yeah, third or fourth nighttime, you know, or I could say, as Milton Berle would say, good evening, ladies and germs. And that was 1953. My name is Evan Weiner. This is the beginning of the 1950s, the fabulous 50s, when Dwight Eisenhower assumes the office of the presidency of the United States on January 20th, 1953. And like I said before, the night before, Lucy was on. And Lucy's giving birth to little Ricky. And who drew more viewers, Ike or Lucy? Lucy. Lucy got 44 million viewers. Ike only got 29 million viewers to watch him inaugurated. Anyway, so he's sworn in. The next slide will be Joseph Stalin. He's dead. And that's good riddance. The next slide will be the Korean War. A truce is signed. And that basically lets Eisenhower tell American people, hey, no more depression, no more World War II, no more Berlin blockade, no more Korean War. You got money, go out and spend it. And don't worry about spending it. We got to move the next slide here. This is, unless I go over there. The execution of the Rosenbergs is in 1953. The next slide after that is the Iranian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, is overthrown by the CIA. This still impacts us to this day, almost 69 years later. Next slide. Now, Queen Elizabeth takes the throne. Who's still the Queen of England? Now, here's a question for you. Is Prince Charles ever going to sit on the throne? He's been waiting since 1957. 1957, the Queen says, he's my heir. Now, 1957 is 64 years ago. That's a long time to wait for something, isn't it? Anyway, so she takes the throne in 1953. Next one. And there's the East German Uprising, because, you know, the United States shouldn't be the only ones to have some fun overthrowing a government. Why not the Soviet Union, right? Next one after that. Okay, so Eisenhower wins. And one of the reasons Eisenhower gets the victory is he goes after women voters. He makes a real effort to go after women voters. The Eisenhower campaign, it was all about Korea, communism, and corruption. The Republicans looked at Harry Truman, and they're running against Harry Truman. They're not running against Adlai Stevenson. And they viewed the failures of the outgoing Truman administration, and we can do something better. Why would you want to live with Korea anymore? We'll solve it. Why would you want to live with a communist threat? Well, we'll solve it. Why would you want to live with corruption? We'll solve that, even though Richard Nixon's on the ticket in 1952, and Nixon has to do that Checkers speech because he did something corrupt. Eisenhower decided to keep him. And then the Eisenhower campaign accused the Truman administration of neglecting Latin America. You'll see some of that neglect in a couple minutes. And thus leading them into the arms of the wily communist agents waiting to exploit local misery and capitalize on any opportunity to communize the Americas. Remember in the 1950s, you were afraid of the Soviet Union, right? The Russians are coming, and they had the bomb as of 1953. Next slide. We got to go. Anyway, Eisenhower's campaign charged that there were Soviet spies that infiltrated the Truman administration, and that started with Joe McCarthy in 1952, and that becomes a major campaign issue. McCarthyism was a campaign issue in 1952. The Republicans blamed the Democrats for military failure in the fight against Korea, North Korea. And of course, General Douglas MacArthur was fired earlier. Eisenhower easily defeated the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson really didn't even want to run for president, but he was. And this ends 20 years of the wilderness that the Republicans said they were out because Franklin Roosevelt won 4 terms, Harry Truman won 1, and Republicans started thinking, hey, wait a minute. The way things are going, we may never win another presidential race, which is why they got Eisenhower, because they thought he would be popular. The New Deal, the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal, which included the establishment of Social Security, had to go. It wasn't working, at least according to the Republicans. Next slide over. So here he is, January 20th. Oh, and there's that man over there. Oh, I'm with him. I like Ike. Richard Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, and Dwight Eisenhower. And the guy swearing him in is Earl Warren. No, that's not Earl Warren. I'm sorry, that's another guy. Earl Warren would become the Supreme Court Justice in 1953, and I'll talk about that a little later, because Eisenhower and Earl Warren didn't get along after a while. Next slide, please. Okay, Eisenhower was one of the great architects of the D-Day invasion. In fact, he was one of the leaders. And he had considerable respect because of what happened on D-Day in 1944, June 6th, a date I'll always remember because I got married on June 6th. Getting out of Korea, priority. Eisenhower thought about, hey, let's drop a bomb on China, because it was China that was behind North Korea, and they're the ones who are forcing the fight. So, you know what? Why don't we drop a bomb on them, a nuclear bomb? Maybe that'll end it. In July 1953, there was an armistice that took effect with Korea divided along the same boundary it was in 1950 when the war broke out. Eisenhower had realized that unlimited war in the nuclear age was unthinkable, and limited war was unwinnable. And I got a question for you. Has the Korean War ever ended? Yes or no?
No.
No, just a truce. And it is, in fact, the longest war that the United States has fought, far longer than Afghanistan, although on technicality, there was a truce that basically ended the fighting, except the fighting. There were skirmishes, including one in 1968, 1969 with the Pueblo. Next slide. So, it is a truce. It's not a treaty. The next slide over. July 27th, after 3 years of war, the United States, the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, and North Korea and South Korea agreed to this armistice. And the day-to-day fighting in Korea is over. The armistice established a committee of representatives from neutral countries to decide the fate of thousands of prisoners of war on both sides. It was eventually decided that the POWs could choose their own fate, stay where they wanted to or return to their homelands. It's because of that there has never been a treaty that has been signed. And you would say, okay, that happened 68 years ago, surely most of these people are dead, why does it matter? But it matters to this day. And you're talking about remains of POWs, and some of them have been returned to the United States. But until somebody signs off on this, there's just a truce. Next slide, please. A new border between North and South Korea is drawn. South Korea gets some additional territory. The DMZ is the area between the two countries. And the war, it cost 50,000 American lives. 50,000 Americans are killed in this faraway place somewhere out in Eastern Asia. And millions of Koreans and Chinese allegedly were killed. Nobody seems to know the exact number. The war has never officially ended. Why? The POW issue has never been resolved. Next slide. Next slide. We've got to keep going here. Next slide. Next slide. Stalin dies. 1953. He's been running the Soviet Union since 1924. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. On March 6th, Joseph Stalin dies. Except somebody had to tell Stalin he was dead. He led the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. He had brutal purges, which killed millions of innocent citizens, maybe up to 20 million. And he made his name a byword for totalitarian terror, Stalinism. Communists and other hardliners credit him with leading the country to victory in World War II. And there's a lot to it, because without the Soviet Union, perhaps the Americans might not have been able to defeat the Germans and the Axis powers during World War II. The Soviets lost millions of people fighting the war. And he turned it into a nuclear superpower, while critics condemned his repressions. The next slide over. Historians estimate more than 800,000 people were executed during the purges that peaked during the Great Terror. 800,000, 20 million, nobody seems to know. Millions died of harsh labor and cruel treatment in the Gulag prison system. Mass starvation in Ukraine, there's still a problem in Ukraine. Southern Russia, and deportations of ethnic minorities, all under Stalin. Stalin's dead. What comes next? Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev had been around, except he wasn't the heir apparent. The heir apparent is Georgy Malenkov. On March 20th, the Soviet government announces that Khrushchev has been selected as one of 5 men named to the new office of Secretariat of the Communist Party. But Khrushchev gets involved with Malenkov. There's a power struggle, and by September of 1953, Nikita Khrushchev secures enough backing to be named the Secretary of the Communist Party. And here you got, by September of 1950, Eisenhower here, Khrushchev here, the Western powers here, the Warsaw Pact countries here, even though there's not a Warsaw Pact at this point. And the Cold War. After Germany's surrender, spring of 1945, Stalin oversaw the continued occupation and denomination of much of Eastern Europe, despite promises, hey, we're going to allow free elections in a lot of those countries, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and all those other places. Never happened. After World War II, Stalin established communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. 1949, he leads the Soviets into the nuclear age because they exploded an atomic bomb. In 1950, there was a proxy war between North Korea and South Korea. Now, the Soviets, in terms of Stalin, he gives permission to the North Korean leader, Kim Il-sung, invade the United States-supported South Korea, an event that would trigger the Korean War. And there is Stalin and there is Khrushchev during maybe happier times in the 1930s, at least he looks happy. The Americans were wary of Stalinism and Soviet-style communism. The Soviets resented the Americans for decades-long refusal to treat the USSR as a legitimate part of the international community, as well as their delayed entry into World War II. The Americans come in on December 7th, 1941, whereas the war broke out on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Tens of millions of Russians died during the war. Again, like I said, without the Russians or the Soviets, it would have been a lot tougher to defeat Hitler, because Hitler went after the Russians on the east flank. After the war, the grievances erupt into an overwhelming sense of mutual distrust, and Harry Truman declares it's a time of the Cold War. Now, communist hunting in the United States, well, that goes back to the 1930s. 1941, Walt Disney, he has a strike at his animation studio, and he blames the communists. Ronald Reagan is the head of the Screen Actors Guild in the 1940s. He appears before the House on Un-American Activities Committee and said, communists have infiltrated the Screen Actors Guild, so you're looking for communists everywhere. The committee, the House on Un-American Activities, begins hearings to show communist subversion in the United States was alive and well, except they couldn't produce names. In Hollywood, UAC forced hundreds of people who worked in the movie industry to renounce left-wing political beliefs and testify against one another. More than 500 people would lose their jobs hunting communists. Many were blacklisted, starting in 1946-47 with a Hollywood Reporter story by Billy Wilkerson, who ran the Hollywood Reporter, naming 11 communists, including Dalton Trumbo and Howard Koch, among others. Others were unable to work again for more than a decade. UAC also accused State Department workers of engaging in subversive activities. McCarthyism is alive and well, and it starts in 1950 with a talk or speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. Wheeling, West Virginia, if you go there today, and I was there 3 years ago, has maybe 20,000 people. It is a town that has empty, old, looking like bombed out relics of buildings. But in 1950, Wheeling was a town with a lot of money. U.S. Steel was there. Wheeling Steel was there, giving steel around the world, or making steel for people around the world. And it also had the Ohio River, and there was coal mining. And McCarthy is there in February of 1950, and he gives a rambling speech accusing 250 communists had infiltrated the State Department. That created furor in the media of the day, like Joe McCarthy, and catapulted him into the headlines across the country. And in 1953, Eisenhower has to deal with McCarthyism. But he testifies in front of the Senate committee, and they ask him, who are the communists? And he can't produce one name. But he goes on this anti-communist crusade, and to his supporters, he's a dedicated patriot. To his detractors, he's irresponsible, he's a self-seeking witch hunter who's undermining the American traditions of civil liberties. He also alleged that the LGBT community was infiltrating the government, and they were government employees, and they could be blacklisted by enemy agents over their sexuality and betray national secrets. In 1950, there's a special report drawn up by McCarthy's Republican allies, the Senate minority at the time, and they said that gay and lesbian workers were a potential moral threat to the workings of the government. He would be reelected in 1952, and he would get a committee, and here he is with Roy Cohn. I met Roy Cohn back around 1983. He was representing George Steinbrenner. I was covering sports, and that was the Pine Tar game at Yankee Stadium. George Brett hits a home run, and there's pine tar on his bat. The home run is called back. They go to court because there's all kind of legal stuff that they should replay the game. And I meet Roy Cohn because he's George's attorney. And there are two things that struck me. The socks matched the color of his eyes, and he reeked, absolutely reeked of cologne. You couldn't get within 10 feet of him. He smelled. I mean, he really, really smelled. And that was my first impression of Roy Cohn. So McCarthy becomes the chairman of the Committee on Government Operations of the Senate, and its permanent subcommittee on investigations. In 1953, he is constantly in the spotlight investigating various government departments, questioning witnesses about their suspected communist affiliations. Oh, by the way, Joe McCarthy is with Robert Kennedy. He had two lawyers. One was Roy Cohn, one was Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy does not like Roy Cohn. In 1952, Robert Kennedy gets a job with Joe McCarthy. McCarthy had vacationed with the Kennedy family. He dated two of Bobby's sisters. And he tells Joe Kennedy, hey, I'll hire your son, Robert, and he's going to be part of the permanent subcommittee on investigations examining possible communist infiltration of the U.S. government. Except the RFK gets into all kinds of fights with Roy Cohn, which I could only imagine. But he doesn't dislike McCarthy, doesn't dislike McCarthy at all. In fact, Joe McCarthy was the godfather to Robert Kennedy's first child, Kathleen, in 1954. In 1953, Eisenhower does decide, hey, maybe I should listen to Joe McCarthy. He signs the Executive Order 10450, which sanctioned the administration policy of tracking down gay and lesbian government employees and having them fired due to the labeling of sexual perversion as an undesirable trait for employment. Scores of employees were fired or resigned. They were afraid of persecution. And there were various surveillance measures instituted to try and track down the citizens' intimate habits. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested a nuclear bomb, and the communist forces by Mao Zedong take over China. The following year, the start of the Korean War, which lasts till 1953, and the U.S. troops engage in combat against communist-supported forces of North Korea. The advances of communism around the world convinced many U.S. citizens there was a real danger of the Reds taking over their country. Now, how many of you lived in the 1950s and 60s diving under desks at school, fearful that you were going to get something? It was me in the 1960s. And I always said, why would I want to crawl under a desk if they're going to drop? I was 6, 7 years old, mouthing back to my teacher, shut up and get under the desk. But were you afraid? How many of you actually lived with fear in the 1950s and 60s? You did? This is the other end of the Eisenhower years. People lived in fear. In fact, there were all kinds of movies made, one called the Red Scarab, later on in the decade, narrated by Jack Webb, talking about, hey, these look like innocent citizens, but what they really are communist agents. And the bomb, everything else, that was part of growing up in the 1950s. The next slide.
It's not letting me go forward.
Okay, hang on one second here.
I admitted somebody new.
We'll fix this up. And there we go. Okay, how much was this fear going on? Cincinnati Reds baseball team. The Cincinnati Reds changed their name to the Cincinnati Redlegs. Look at the baseball. He's got like a Stalin-type mustache, or Saddam Hussein mustache. The next slide, I will explain all this to you. It's no more Reds as of 1953. It's the Redlegs. The Cincinnati Reds franchise announced on April 9th. It had changed the team's name from Reds to Redlegs. An Associated Press story said it had dropped the Reds' name to disassociate itself from communism and the Red Scare hysteria, which was taking place in the 1950s. The Cincinnati Reds general manager, Gabe Paul, later said his team wanted to be certain we wouldn't be confused with the Russian Reds. Oh, Lucy, how many of you know that Lucy was outed as a communist? She was outed as a communist. And in the next slide you will see the card. Oh, well, actually before that. The blacklist of the 1950s involved the practice of denying employment to entertainment industry professionals believed to or have been communists or sympathizers. Not just actors, but screenwriters and directors, musicians like Leonard Bernstein and Pete Seeger. And other entertainment professionals were barred from working from the studios. And Lucy the Red. And this is what gets her in trouble. Somebody came up with her 1936 voter registration card. And in that voter registration card, I intend to affiliate at the ensuing primary election with the Communist Party. That, in 1953, should have sealed the end of Lucy's career. And let me tell you about Red Channels. This was all about the movie industry around that time. And I will read this to you. Americans don't patronize Reds. You can drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. This track will tell you how. Why we must drive them out. The Reds have made our screen, radio and TV's most effective fifth column in America. The Reds of Hollywood and Broadway have always been the chief financial support of communism propaganda in America. Our own films made by Red producers, directors, writers, and stars are being used by Moscow in Asia, Africa, the Balkans, throughout Europe, to create hatred of America. Right now, films are being made to craftily glorify Marxism, although I thought films in the 1930s glorified Marxism, Groucho, Chico, and Harpo, right? UNESCO, one worldism, via your TV set, and they're being piped into your living room, and they are poisoning the mind of your children. How many of you were young people in 1953 who had TVs? Did you feel poisoned?
No.
Well, okay. Poisoned the minds of your children under your very eyes. So remember, if you patronize a film made by Red producers, writers, stars and studios, you are aiding and abetting communism. Aiding and abetting communism. But Ike was no fan of McCarthy in 1953, but he didn't know what to do with McCarthy. The president, a five-star general who led the D-Day invasion of Europe during World War II, became especially incensed in 1953 because McCarthy crossed the line. He accused the U.S. Army of harboring communists. But Eisenhower does nothing in 1953, except he wouldn't mention McCarthy's name. And McCarthy wanted publicity, and Eisenhower wouldn't give him the publicity. When reporters asked him about McCarthy, the president would answer, "I never taught personalities." Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953. Again, middle of the communist scare. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg died on June 19th at Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York. They were the first two American citizens to be executed for conspiracy to commit espionage, and the first to suffer that penalty during peacetime. In 1939, the two were active members of the Communist Party of the United States. In 1940, Julius obtained a job as a civilian engineer with the U.S. Army Signal Corps, and he and Ethel, allegedly, worked together to disclose U.S. military secrets to the Soviet Union. Ethel's brother was Sergeant David Greenglass, who was assigned to a job as a machinist, the Manhattan Project, the Oppenheimer Project, to build an atomic weapon, and he provided the Rosenbergs with data on nuclear weapons. The Rosenbergs turned over this information to Harry Gold, a Swiss-born courier for an espionage ring, who then passed it on to Antonelli Yakovlev, the Soviet Union's vice consul in New York City. And there is Julius Rosenberg. Rosenberg was discharged by the Army in 1945 for having lied about his membership in the Communist Party. Now, my mother-in-law, when she passed away 7 years ago, said that in the 1930s, she was born in 1921, they used to go to dances. She was in the Bronx, she used to go to dances, and they would have a card. Are you a communist, or do you want to sign up for the Communist Party? And a lot of people got in trouble innocently signing that card at some dance. Anyway, Gold was arrested May 23rd, 1950 in connection with the case of the British spy Klaus Fuchs, who was arrested for giving U.S. and British nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. The arrests of Greengrass and Julius Rosenberg followed in June and July, and Ethel was arrested in August. Another conspirator, Morton Sobel, a college classmate of Julius Rosenberg, fled to Mexico but was extradited. The Rosenbergs were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, brought to trial. March 6, 1951, Greengrass was the chief witness for the prosecution, Rosenberg's brother-in-law. On March 29th, the two Rosenbergs were found guilty. April 5th, 51, they were sentenced to death. Sobel and Gold received 30-year prison terms. Greenglass, who was tried separately, gets to go to jail for 15 years. And there is Sing Sing. I was at Sing Sing giving a talk near Ossining the other day. And I said, you know what? I should put a picture of Sing Sing in there, right? There it is. For 2 years, the Rosenberg case continued. The constitutionality in terms of appeal, the constitutionality and the applicability of the Espionage Act of 1917, under which the Rosenbergs were tried, as well as the impartiality of the trial judge, Irving R. Kaufman, who pronounced sentencing, accused them of a crime worse than murder. The key issues during the appeal process: 7 different appeals reached the Supreme Court of the United States, all denied pleas for executive clemency, dismissed by Harry Truman in 1952, Eisenhower in 1953. And there's Sing Sing again, where Ethel Rosenberg was electrocuted along with her husband. They were in Old Sparky. There is actually a Sing Sing prison in the middle of Ossining, which I haven't gone to, but next time I'm up in Ossining, I plan to go to, because it looks like it's a good 10 minutes to kill. But anyway, Old Sparky was where they were killed. Ethel became the first woman executed by the U.S. government since Mary Surratt was hanged in 1865 for alleged role in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Cold War hysteria. Something that Eisenhower could not get rid of, even though he wanted to. Eisenhower was born in 1890. It's amazing that his policies and the things that he did in the 1950s from somebody born in 1890 are still with us today. That was the time when men were men and women knew their place was in the home. And people who were not in charge absolutely knew their place in society. But for Eisenhower, once the Korean War was over, he wanted people to forget about that depression, 1929 to 1939 or so. Forget about World War I, 1941 to 45. Forget about the Berlin blockade and the Cold War, which starts after World War II in 1945. And forget about Korea, which ends in July after 3 years. But there was always that fear of the nuclear missile attack from the Soviet Union, even until my days in school in the 1960s. The Cold War hysteria. And some of you obviously lived through the Cold War hysteria. The Soviets have an atomic weapon. On August 20th, the Soviet press announced the USSR had tested a hydrogen bomb. The first test of the layer cake takes place on August 12th. 4 days earlier, one of the Soviet leaders, Malenkov, announced to the Supreme Soviet that the U.S. no longer had the monopoly in hydrogen weapons. On October 30th of 1953, Eisenhower formally approves a top-secret document of the United States National Security Council, NSC 162/2, that the United States must maintain an arsenal of nuclear weapons and have to expand it because they have to counter the communist threat. Oh, BP. How many of you get gas at British Petroleum or BP? Okay. Do you know that the United States overthrew the Iranian government to save BP? Did you know that? You knew that? We got one person who knew that in 1953. So listen and you shall hear all about the ride that, well, not Paul Revere. Anyway, the lead up to the coup in Iran starts in 1951 and it's all about oil. Has anything changed since 1951? It's all about oil. March of 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh presents the idea of nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company to the Iranian parliament, and it's eventually approved by the parliament. And he's elected the prime minister in 1951. In May of 1951, Britain says, we're going to have an embargo on Iranian oil and bans the exportation of goods to Iran in retaliation. You're going to take over our oil? Well, we're not going to send you stuff. Britain also gets its navy together to show Iran they need business. In June, Harry Truman, tries to mediate the situation between Iran and Britain diplomatically. British decides to take legal action against Iran in the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice in July of 51 said, hey, ain't our problem, you go figure it out. It's a private company, British Petroleum, private company, and the Iranian government. it doesn't fall under the matter of treaties. You go figure it out. And here's Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. In 1952, Iran severs diplomatic ties with Great Britain. In 1953, there's a failed coup. And who's behind the failed coup? The United States. The initial one was a failed coup. And the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, has to flee Iran. But 4 days later, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, would orchestrate yet another coup to destabilize the government and succeeds. He was a popular figure, Mossadegh, in Iran. He introduced a large number of social and economic policies, but the most significant was that oil decision. Great Britain had controlled Iranian oil for decades through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and that was his fatal mistake. Eisenhower, too, wanted to show that he was tough on communism because some of the Iranian people were talking to the Soviets, and they had to do whatever they had to do to keep Iran in their back pocket. So, what do? You get a guy who you know is going to be loyal to you. And he was the Shah of Iran. And he would cause all kinds of problems that linger until this day. The American CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service funded and led a covert operation to dispose Mossadegh with the help of military forces disloyal to his government. It was called Operation Ajax, like the laundry detergent, stronger than dirt, Ajax. It depended on orders signed by the Shah to dismiss the Prime Minister and replace him with the General Zahedi, a choice agreed to by the British and Americans. Mission accomplished. The oil is safe. I went there in December of 1953. I dealt with Nixon from 85 to 89. The reason I met him is he solved the dispute between the Major League Baseball owners and the Major League Baseball umpires in 1985, and please call me Dick. So I got to know him a little bit. So Dick Nixon is in Iran in 1953 on December 7th, and several days of riots because Nixon's there, because they wanted to give him hail and hearty welcome. And this is all reaction to the overthrow of the government. 3 students are shot dead by police in Tehran. Meanwhile, in French Indochina, which is about ready to become Laos, Cambodia, North and South Vietnam, the French are losing. They cannot keep control of what would become Vietnam. Eisenhower doesn't want another Korea. He doesn't want to send American troops in there because he wants you to go out, spend money, and have a good time, and forget about the wars. Now, my father told me, he was in the Army between 1953 and 55, he was prepared to go to French Indochina, that his unit was prepared to go in case they were needed for fighting, and then if that would have happened, there was a chance I might not be here talking to you about this. Anyway, Eisenhower remained determined that Americans should stay out of that French war in Vietnam. So what is his solution? Well, let's throw more money at France. And let's give them weapons so they can continue to fight the communists, so American soldiers wouldn't have to. In a speech in Seattle, August 4th, 1953, he told his audience why he was so concerned with Indochina. If Indochina goes, several things happen right away. India would be outflanked. Burma would be in no position for defense. And would the free world hold the rich empire of Indonesia? So you see, somewhere along the line, this must be blocked. And it must be blocked now. And that's what we're trying to do. It would be the start of the domino theory. Because if one country goes, the rest will go. Cambodia, meanwhile, gets its independence from France at that time. On November 9th, 1953, France gives up. King Sihanouk becomes, under King Sihanouk, it becomes the Kingdom of Cambodia. Meanwhile, there are problems in Cuba. The problems in Cuba start in 1933 with the Sergeants' Revolt. And that is Fidel Castro. And that's Fulgencio Batista. Castro there, Batista. They would become enemies by the end of the 1950s. Batista leads a military coup in 1952 and takes power in Cuba. Didn't matter, he was anti-communist, so he's Eisenhower's guy in Cuba. In 1933, he takes control through something called the Sergeants' Revolt. Remember I just talked about Lucy? Well, Desi Arnaz and his family were in Cuba in 1933. They were rich. Arnaz's family was politically connected and politicians. When Batista decides to knock off the government and becomes the most powerful leader in the country, he basically exiles a lot of his detractors. Among them, the Arnaz family that flees to Miami Beach. Batista is elected president in 1940. His term ends in 1944. He travels the world. He returns in 1952 as a brutal dictator, controlling the university, the press, and Congress, and embezzles huge sums of money from the soaring economy. Why is it soaring? Because it's Americans' economy, or America has most of the business. That's Castro in 1953. In 1953, in July, a group of rebels led by Castro attack the Moncada barracks. The attack fails. Batista suspends many constitutional rights in retaliation. Castro is jailed and ordered to spend 15 years in prison. Meanwhile, hey, why should the Americans have all the fun, right? Why not the Soviets? Well, the Soviets put the boot on East Germany. The East Germany uprising starts on June 16th. Workers in East Berlin rose up in protest against the government's demands to increase productivity. Within days, nearly 1 million East Germans joined the protests and began rioting across East Germany's cities and towns. In order to prolong the uprising and win support for the West, the United States sends food to East Germany. Okay, the uprising was a product of the Soviets and East German reaction to West Germany being admitted to NATO. The Western powers signed the General and European Defense Community treaties. The treaties, in a sense, rejected Stalin's offer to unify Germany on the condition that it remained unarmed. So you got the Cold War setting up there. In response to West Germany's absorption and rearmament by Western powers, the Soviets and the regime of East Germany's General Secretary, Walter Ulbricht, decided to unequivocally transform East Germany into a Soviet satellite state. And there is the leader of East Germany, Ulbricht, constructing socialism, enacted forced collectivization of agriculture, a campaign against private trade and industry, and the development of heavy industry. Collectivism produced severe food shortages that begins in winter and spring of '53, and the remilitarization and suppression of churches and prosecution of the opposition added to the strain of the population. East Germans started to go to West Germany via West Berlin. The protest movements flourished and the expression of general dissatisfaction hits the public. And here is the uprising. At this point, in April, after the death of Stalin, the Soviet authorities said, you know, we better do something with the regime here, which was actually, in their opinion, more restrictive than what was going on in the Soviet Union. So, hey, you know what? Relax part of it. Discontinue parts of it. Many people perceive the new course as capitulation to the West, but the treatment of workers remained harsh. The relaxation of constructing socialism transformed into general discontentment and open defiance. The new course. All of a sudden, people decided we're going to go into open defiance. Next one. And by June 16th, there was a general strike. The Soviet occupation forces moved in, martial law is declared, and that's the end of the East German uprising. And as you can see, the troops, tanks are rolling in. Soviets would do this in 1956 and 1968. 39 people killed, most of them demonstrators. The events were significantly downplayed in the Soviet Union and the other Eastern Bloc states. Suburbia. How many of you grew up in suburbia here on Long Island? Nobody? Where'd you grow up?
Suburbia.
Suburbia.
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, but was it a suburb?
Yep.
Levittown type suburb?
Well, sort of.
In 1957, Levittown, which was here, Levittown, Abraham Levitt and his sons, William and Alfred, broke ground on a planned community in Nassau County. Within a few years, farmland becomes this suburban oasis. Many of the men who buy the homes had returned from World War II. This would also go on in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. Levitt sold houses to only whites, excluding African Americans. By 1953, 70,000 people lived in Levittown. Anybody knew anybody who lived in Levittown? You did? You did? It was the largest community in the United States without black residents. Levittown's lease stipulated that tenants agreed not to permit the premises to be sued or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. And all the houses looked the same. They all looked the same. All of them. There was uniformity. Young families, white families, black families, even those who could afford to move to the suburbs were unwelcome. And America becomes a consumer country, buying and selling more. The Diners Club starts in 1950, the credit card, and credit cards come to be in the 1950s. The suburbs would prosper, the cities would suffer. Rising car and truck ownership made it easier for businesses and middle-class and working-class white residents to flee to the suburbs, leaving behind the poor and minority populations in financial crisis. Transit systems lost riders and money, and traffic jammed the streets. Enjoy yourself, like my wife's in-laws at one of these beach clubs on the Long Island Sound in Westchester. There they are taking the pictures, enjoying themselves. America was incredibly prosperous once Eisenhower took office. It had no economic competition around the world. They were producing goods at an astonishing rate. White-collar jobs were plentiful. The rise of the middle class grew more than $1 million a year, and that was the engine that controlled America in the 1950s. How much you bought? Well, status symbol. By 1953, the Diners Club card became the first internationally accepted charge card, although in the 1920s, department stores and oil companies started offering metal charge plates and courtesy cards that customers could use for purchases. Americans buying more and more TVs and other goods, and everyone had to have a TV, because if you weren't, you were socially not there. Planned obsolescence. Manufacturers started to design products to become obsolete, to wear out, to become outdated in a short amount of time. How many of you have one of these? The one on the left is a color TV. In 1953, $1,100 for the color TV. Actually, color TV becomes available right after Christmas. 15-inch screen. The other one was $1,000. With that comes commercials, and television becomes the marketplace for salespeople. Swanson's TV dinner. You had a lot of those. Were they any good?
Some were.
Some were?
When you don't cook.
When you don't cook. When you don't cook,
That's true.
call Chicken Delight.
Oh, I had that. That was delicious.
It's out of business.
My children, we all would have.
You went in Bayside. You went for a Don't Cook Tonight, call Chicken Delight.
Correct.
I could do a lot more commercials too if you want me to. Swanson's and Sons, TV dinner, branded frozen meal. 5,000 units were sold when it was introduced on September 10th. A year later, 10 million TV dinners sold. Americans quickly warmed up to the concept of eating a pre-made Salisbury steak or pot roast in front of I Love Lucy. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1953 with her young kids who are still waiting. There she is with Prince Philip in 1953. This was such an event that American television hired chartered planes. They filmed it to fly it back to the United States so Americans could see it. Queen Elizabeth took the coronation oath at Westminster Abbey. She was crowned with the St. Edward's crown, the same one that her father was crowned with 16 years before. She wore the century-old coronation ring on the fourth finger of her right hand. Television was there. Film shot in England, sent back to New York so Americans could enjoy too. 27 million Brits watched on TV, 11 million more listened on radio. And Playboy. Playboy. I never had Playboy when I was a kid. I just want to let you know, the rumors of me having Playboy under the bed, that was somebody else who lived down the street. I never had Playboy, and if I did, I would have read it for the articles. In January 1952, Hugh Hefner left his job as a copywriter for Esquire after he didn't get a $5 raise. In 1953, he took out a mortgage loan of $600, raised $8,000 from 45 investors, including his mother, to launch Playboy, which was initially going to be called Stag Party. And there's Hef. He's not wearing his bathrobe. I don't know what's going on there. There's Hef. The first issue, published December 1953, featured Marilyn Monroe from a 1949 nude calendar shoot she did under a pseudonym when she needed some money before she was famous. Monroe did not consent to send her pictures to Hefner, but she couldn't do anything to stop it. She didn't get paid for it. The issue sold more than 50,000 copies. The issue was undated because Hefner thought it might be the only magazine he would ever print. He never expected success. Playboy. Hefner and the Playboy brand were inseparable. Both advertised themselves as emblems of the sexual revolution and the escape from American priggishness and wider social intolerance. In the 50s, there were a lot of, if you're a good girl, you don't do that. Look at that. And the films were produced by Coronet Films that told a woman how to act. How to act and be popular with the boys. Hefner was hated by the guardians of the 1950s social order, such as the FBI director J. Edgar Hoover, and by the 1960s by feminists. He panned American Puritanism at the time when doctors refused contraceptives to single women. In the Hollywood Hays Production Code dictated separate beds for married couples. The Milwaukee becomes a big league city. They get a baseball team. You weren't a big league city until you had a Major League Baseball team. The American and National Leagues of Baseball had the same city since 1903. Very few cities had teams. They were Major League teams. New York had cities. New York had 3, Boston 2, Chicago 2, Philadelphia 2, St. Louis 2. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Washington had the remaining 5 teams. March 18th, Lou Perini moved his Boston Braves National League franchise to Milwaukee, which began a baseball migration that culminated with the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants moving to California in 1958 and the 1950s. Boston fizzles, Milwaukee looks good. Milwaukee civic and elected officials in the late 1940s were looking for a Major League Baseball team to replace the long-departed Milwaukee Brewers, a team that lasted 1 year. In 1901, the Milwaukee team moved to St. Louis in 1902. The city put aside funds for a new park that could seat 28,000 people, maybe up to 36,000 with improvements. In 1950, the construction would start on Milwaukee County Stadium. It was the first time that politicians decided to spend money on the ballpark, which they do today. It would not be the last. And there is the stadium when it opened. That convinced the Brooklyn Dodgers owner Walter O'Malley, after he studied the move, that he needed a new stadium in Brooklyn. Without his new stadium, the Brooklyn New York Dodgers could not compete with Milwaukee. Perini's team set an all-time National League attendance record, 1,826,397. He had a sweetheart lease, made money, and this would begin owners pitting city against city to get better stadium deals. Because it was there, Edmund Hillary climbs Mount Everest. Along with Tenzing Norgay, the Nepali shepherd, they become the first to climb Mount Everest. Others had attempted to reach the summit. None were successful, and some perished in the attempt. And the legacy as we end. That's me in what used to be East Germany. And guess what they have in the former East Germany?
McDonald's.
The Golden Arches. The Golden Arches. The Berlin Wall comes down and they go to malls and they get McDonald's. The legacy. One more slide. Two more slides. The United States has no government with Iran. Protesters in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution cited the CIA's overthrow of the Mujahideen government as the reason for the revolution. CIA has come up with 3 different accounts of the overthrow. He was arrested, served 3 years in prison, died under house arrest in 1967. The Shah became one of America's most trusted Cold War allies. Stalinism was denounced by Khrushchev, but the Cold War would continue. McCarthy would be ruined by 1954. He would die in 1957, but the hunt for communists would continue into the 1960s. Books have been written about the Rosenbergs and the fairness of their trials. I think there's one more after that one. The Korean conflict has never ended. East Germany built the wall starting in 1961. The wall came crumbling down November 9th, 1989. Castro would be released from prison in 1955, flee to Mexico, and with his band of men would come back in 1956 and overthrow Batista on January 1st, 1959. White housing sales made illegal, and the Milwaukee Braves baseball team would move to Atlanta in 1966. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Questions or comments? This is the first time I've done this one. So,
Very good.
so any questions or comments about you in the 1950s? None? No comments? None on how some of your parents would go out with the other parents and have a book on how to raise kids and how Dr. Spock's book was a big deal?
Yes.
Right. So you have nothing to say other than you like Chicken Delight.
Well, that really was great.
Thank
Did you
you.
have it?
I don't remember it.
It was very good because we lived in an apartment house in Bayside. Pulled them up, we sent over, but I don't know whatever happened to them.
They went out of business.
I assume so.
So did household financial, remember HFC, never borrow money needlessly unless you
I
must,
just remember food that I should write.
the food. Okay, so well, thank you so much. We got started a little late, but that's okay.
So not next month, but the one after.
In December.
Evan's coming back with a continuation.
Great.
So every other month.